When a tree is stripped of its leaves by a violent storm, it does not weep for what has fallen into the mud. It does not rage at the wind. It simply and silently drives its roots deeper into the cold earth. Eleanor Vance was a woman of deep roots. She sat in the freezing, heavily air-conditioned office of a high-priced downtown law firm, staring at the massive expanse of a polished mahogany table. Her hands rested quietly on her lap. They were not the soft, manicured hands of a typical wealthy wife who spent her afternoons at the country club. They were rough, etched with deep lines, and bearing the faint, permanent scars of a lifetime of grueling, hard labor. Across from her sat Richard Vance, her husband of 44 years. He was 69 years old, but desperately trying to project the image of a man 20 years younger. His hair was unnaturally dark from cheap dye, and his posture dripped with a careless, practiced arrogance that made him practically unrecognizable to her. He did not look at her. Beside him sat Chloe, a 28-year-old woman radiating the heavy, suffocating scent of an expensive floral perfume. She wore a silk dress that cost more than Eleanor's entire wardrobe. "Sign on the dotted line, Eleanor," Richard said coldly. Eleanor picked up the heavy brass pen. She did not tremble. She did not plead. She signed her name with the exact same steady, meticulous handwriting she had used to build his entire life from the ground up. The silence in the room was heavy, pressing down on her shoulders, but Eleanor's mind briefly slipped backward through the decades, traversing the 44 years of unrelenting, silent sacrifice. She remembered the suffocating Missouri summers, the brutal days when the temperature pushed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and they had nothing but a rusted desk fan to keep them from passing out. She remembered their original hardware store, a tiny, drafty shack located 3 miles outside the city limits. It smelled constantly of pine sawdust, spilled engine oil, and raw, desperate ambition. Richard had always been the charming face of the operation. He was the man who shook hands, remembered the names of local contractors, and cracked jokes over cups of cheap diner coffee. But Eleanor had been the engine. She was the one who stayed awake until 3 in the morning under a flickering fluorescent bulb, balancing the complicated ledgers by hand. She was the one who negotiated fiercely with ruthless suppliers, who painted the towering warehouse walls, who unloaded 50 pounds of bags of concrete, and measured out thousands of yards of chain-link fencing when the delivery men failed to show up. Over the decades, through her sweat and his charm, that single dusty store had mutated into a massive 12-location corporate empire spanning across 3 different counties. She had built the solid foundation. He had simply painted his name on the roof. Now it was all gone. 5 years ago, Richard placed a thick, intimidating stack of legal documents in front of her. He had called it a routine corporate tax restructuring strategy, claiming it was necessary to protect their expanding assets from aggressive federal audits. Trusting the man she had loved since her youth, Eleanor signed the papers without bringing in her own legal counsel. It was a fatal error. It was not a tax strategy at all. It was a meticulously crafted post-nuptial agreement, a lethal legal trap designed to systematically sever her from everything she had ever touched or built. Coupled with millions of dollars he had quietly funneled into hidden offshore accounts over the last decade, the trap was entirely flawless. The court recognizes the division of assets as final and binding, the senior lawyer droned, his voice devoid of any human empathy as he gathered the stamped papers. Eleanor was leaving this room with absolutely nothing.
She was losing the massive, custom-built mansion she had designed with her own hands. She would never again walk across the reclaimed oak floors she had personally sanded, nor sit on the wide wraparound porch facing the quiet eastern sunrise. The 12 hardware stores, the lucrative investment portfolios, the sprawling acres of commercial real estate, they all legally belonged to Richard, and by extension, they belonged to Chloe. "Are we done here?" Chloe asked, her voice high and laced with intense irritation. "We have a reservation at the steakhouse in 20 minutes. Eleanor slowly stood up. She smoothed the wrinkles from her plain beige linen slocks. She looked directly at Richard, searching his eyes for even a brief flicker of remorse, a ghost of the ambitious young man she had married 44 years ago. There was nothing but the hollow gaze of a complete stranger. She turned and walked out of the icy office building, stepping onto the sweltering concrete pavement of downtown Oakhaven. The blinding afternoon sun beat down on her shoulders. Beside the curb rested a battered, faded canvas suitcase containing a few changes of practical clothes and a pair of sturdy leather work boots. That was everything she currently owned in the world. She opened her worn leather wallet and looked inside. A single $10 bill, a crumpled 5, 4 crisp 1s, and exactly 45 cents in dull, heavy coins. $19.45. That was the precise, pathetic monetary value of 44 years of absolute devotion and back-breaking labor. She stood on the busy street corner at 67 years old, entirely erased from the narrative of her own life. A sleek silver Mercedes pulled out of the underground parking garage, its wide tires hissing softly against the hot asphalt. The tinted passenger window rolled down just enough for Eleanor to see Chloe leaning over, laughing loudly at something Richard had said. The luxury car accelerated quickly, merging into the heavy afternoon traffic and disappearing down the long, shimmering avenue. Eleanor did not cry. She snapped her wallet shut, adjusted the collar of her simple cotton blouse, and gripped the handle of her old suitcase. She began to walk down the cracked sidewalk, her head held perfectly high, her steps measured, calm, and full of quiet dignity. But as the red taillights of the Mercedes faded into the distant summer haze, Richard Vance drove away completely oblivious. He did not know that throwing Eleanor out on the street with nothing but empty pockets was the single most expensive mistake he would ever make.
The night air in Oakhaven dropped to a bitter 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Eleanor Vance sat in the driver's seat of her rusted 1998 Volvo station wagon, a vehicle she had kept only because it was registered entirely in her maiden name. The faded upholstery smelled faintly of old dust and dried pine needles. She pulled her thin wool coat tighter around her shoulders, ignoring the deep ache radiating through her lower back. She did not shed a single tear. She simply survived. Under the pale, flickering orange glow of a distant street lamp, she carefully laid out her entire net worth on the cracked vinyl dashboard. One $10 bill, one $5 bill, 4 single-dollar bills, a quarter, a dime, and 2 nickels. $19.45. It was exactly enough to buy 2 loaves of cheap white bread, a jar of generic peanut butter, and perhaps a few gallons of gasoline to keep the heater running for short, desperate intervals. She stared at the small pile of paper and metal for a long time. It represented the totality of her existence. Then, with deliberate slowness, she swept the money back into her leather wallet. She reclined the stiff driver's seat, closed her eyes, and listened to the distant hum of the highway. Morning brought a relentless, driving rainstorm that washed the county in heavy sheets of gray.
Eleanor woke up with her joints locked in agonizing stiffness. Seeking temporary shelter from the freezing downpour, she walked 2 miles down the paved shoulder of the road and stepped inside the heavy oak doors of the Oakhaven County Courthouse. Her wet leather boots squeaked softly against the pristine marble floors. She wandered the long, echoing hallways until she found a warm room filled with rows of metal folding chairs, crowded with local real estate developers and bored county clerks. It was the monthly tax delinquency auction. Eleanor stood quietly in the back corner, her wet coat dripping slowly from the hem of her coat, letting the monotonous voice of the auctioneer wash over her. Properties were being sold off to aggressive investors who barked out bids in the tens of thousands of dollars. They were men in sharp suits who reminded her entirely too much of Richard, men who saw land not as earth and stone, but as abstract numbers on a balance sheet. "Moving on to parcel 9B, the auctioneer announced loudly, adjusting his reading glasses. "Toll booth number 4 on Old Route 42, roughly 1/10 of an acre of overgrown weeds and a derelict wooden structure. Has not seen a paying vehicle since the state highway bypassed it 50 years ago." A low chuckle rippled through the crowded room. "The county simply wants it off the maintenance registry," the auctioneer continued, his tone thick with dry amusement. "Do we have a starting bid of $5? Someone give me $5 for the finest mosquito breeding ground in the entire county." The room erupted in loud, mocking laughter. Standing near the front row was a man named Thomas, a wealthy lumber supplier who frequently golfed with Richard. He turned around, scanning the room to share the joke, and his eyes locked directly onto Eleanor. His smirk widened into a cruel, knowing sneer. He leaned over and whispered something to the man sitting beside him. They both looked at her dripping coat and worn shoes with blatant, undisguised disgust. Eleanor felt the heavy weight of their judgment. She did not look away. She looked past the arrogant men, past the laughing crowd, and focused entirely on the auctioneer. She thought of the suffocating emptiness of the rusted Volvo. She thought of the $19.45 in her pocket. She raised her rough, calloused right hand high into the air. The laughter died instantly. "Well now," the auctioneer said, blinking in sheer surprise, "I see a bid in the back. $5. Do I hear 10? Silence hung heavy in the warm, dry air. No developer in their right mind would pay a single dime for a worthless pile of wood on a dead road. "Going once, going twice, sold to the lady in the wet coat for exactly $5. Eleanor walked slowly down the center aisle, her posture rigidly straight, ignoring the bewildered and mocking stares of the men she passed. She reached the clerk's folding table and opened her worn leather wallet. She pulled out the single, wrinkled $5 bill. She placed it flat on the table, smoothing out the corners with her thumb. It was a transaction of absolute dignity. The clerk stamped a thick stack of papers and handed her the official deed. She turned and walked back out into the freezing rain, holding the document tightly against her chest. The auctioneer watched her leave, shaking his head at the pathetic sight, completely unaware that the damp piece of paper he had just surrendered was the only key to a door that had been locked tight for over 80 decades.
Eleanor steered the heavy rusted Volvo off the smooth pavement of the main highway and onto the fractured asphalt of Old Route 42. The road was a forgotten, decaying artery of Oakhaven County. It was choked with tall weeds, riddled with deep, treacherous potholes, and lined with dying elm trees that cast long, skeletal shadows across the hood of her vehicle. She drove exactly 4 miles down the dead-end stretch, the tires crunching loudly over broken gravel, before putting the engine in park. She stepped out into the damp, freezing air. Before her stood Parcel 9B.
It was nothing more than a severe, rotting wooden shack sitting on a tiny patch of overgrown, worthless earth. The structure was completely swallowed by decades of aggressive poison ivy and thick, strangling vines that seemed intent on dragging the building down into the mud. Every single pane of glass in the tiny tall windows was shattered, leaving jagged, sharp teeth jutting out from the rotting wooden frames. The roof sagged heavily in the middle, defeated by countless brutal winters and heavy snowfalls, and the thick, suffocating stench of black mold and wet decay rolled off the building in foul waves. To any normal observer, it was absolute garbage. But the earth holds memories long after men have forgotten them. 82 years earlier, in the bitter, desperate winter of 1934, the United States government had faced a quiet, terrifying crisis. The Great Depression was tearing the country apart. Desperate men were robbing banks with submachine guns, and the Federal Reserve needed secure, invisible routes to transport massive quantities of physical wealth between isolated regional branches. Old Route 42 was not a dead, empty road back then. It was a vital, heavily guarded transit corridor. This small building was never truly a toll booth. It was constructed by the United States National Guard under the absolute strictest veil of military secrecy. It was meticulously designed to look perfectly mundane, a simple, unassuming checkpoint meant to collect pennies from passing farmers, while secretly serving as an impenetrable overnight holding station for heavily armed convoys. When the new interstate highway system was paved 20 miles away in the late 1950s, the military quietly sealed the site, wiped it from the active ledgers, and walked away, letting time and creeping nature bury their quiet work. Eleanor walked slowly toward the ruined structure. Her heavy leather boots sank 2 full inches into the thick, freezing mud. She did not flinch at the foul smell of rotting timber. She did not despair at the overwhelming, back-breaking task lying ahead of her. She did not think of Richard sitting in his pristine, climate-controlled office, drinking expensive scotch. She simply reached out with her bare, calloused hands and grabbed a thick handful of the thorny vines clinging stubbornly to the front wall. She pulled with all her strength. The vines tore away from the wood with a wet, heavy ripping sound, exposing the bare bones of the building beneath. Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as 4 decades of sharp, practical experience flooded her mind. She had spent 44 years ordering raw building materials, analyzing structural load capacities, and managing massive commercial construction sites while her husband played golf with wealthy developers. She knew the exact tensile strength of industrial steel, the precise curing time of commercial cement, and the specific density of old-growth timber. She wiped a thick layer of wet, freezing moss from the main load-bearing pillar. It was not cheap pine, it was solid, virgin white oak. The vertical beam was easily 10 inches thick, rough-hewn, completely free of termite damage, and dense as a block of solid iron. Eleanor dropped to her knees in the freezing mud, completely ignoring the bitter cold seeping instantly through her thin linen slacks. She used her bare hands to dig fiercely into the wet earth around the base of the structure, clawing away deep inches of dead leaves, broken glass, and heavily compacted dirt. Her bleeding fingers hit something brutal and hard. It was not a pile of loose field stones, which was the standard, cheap foundation for temporary county structures built in that era. It was a continuous, poured slab of high-strength, military-grade reinforced concrete. She scraped more dirt away, her breath pluming white in the freezing air, revealing the thick, oxidized ridges of steel rebar buried deep within the immovable cement. A toll booth meant to collect nickels did not need a foundation capable of surviving a direct bomb strike. She stood up slowly, wiping the dark mud from her raw hands onto her coat. Her heart beat a slow, steady, powerful rhythm against her ribs. The wealthy men at the courthouse had laughed at her, seeing only the superficial rot, the peeling paint and the sagging roof. They lacked the intelligence and the vision to see beneath the ugly surface. They were exactly like Richard. They judged the world entirely by its polished exterior, completely blind to the enduring, unbreakable strength of the framework hidden underneath. The skin of the building was dead. The skeleton was completely indestructible. Eleanor walked back to the rusted Volvo, opened the creaking trunk, and pulled out a heavy steel crowbar and a pair of worn canvas work gloves. She had $19.45 to her name. She had no home, no family, and no safety net to catch her. But she had a solid foundation, and she had two incredibly strong hands. She walked back to the ruined doorway and began to rip away the rotting floorboards, completely unaware of the massive, impenetrable block of solid steel resting silently in the darkness just a few feet below her.
The first 14 days were a brutal, unending symphony of pure physical agony. Eleanor woke at exactly 5 o'clock every single morning. Her breath formed thick white clouds in the freezing 40-degree Fahrenheit interior of the rusted 1998 Volvo, her aging joints screaming in a silent, fiery protest from the relentless cold in the stiff vinyl seats. She ate exactly half a can of cheap, cold-baked beans directly from the metal tin using a fragile plastic spoon, drank 16 ounces of tepid tap water she had gathered from a gas station 3 miles down the highway, and tied her worn leather work boots with stiff, unbending fingers. She did not complain. She stepped out into the freezing, ankle-deep mud and simply went to work. Her tools were painfully primitive and wildly inadequate for the massive task at hand. She possessed only a heavy, rust-covered steel crowbar, a claw hammer with a splintered wooden handle she had found buried deep in the dirt, and a dull, rusted handsaw that caught stubbornly on every single stroke. She spent the entire first week relentlessly attacking the exterior rot of the 12-foot by 14-foot structure. She swung the heavy hammer against the decaying pine siding, shattering the waterlogged boards into hundreds of wet, pulpy splinters, ripping away decades of aggressive, poisonous ivy, scraping off thick, toxic sheets of black mold with a rusted putty knife, and slowly exposing the magnificent, unyielding solid white oak skeleton standing proudly beneath the complete ruin. The physical toll on her 67-year-old body was absolute and unforgiving. Her hands quickly became a ruined landscape of deep, painful blisters, torn calluses, and dark, spreading bruises. Bright red blood seeped regularly from her cracked knuckles, staining the smooth wooden handles of her meager tools a deep, permanent, rusted brown. Sweat poured down her spine despite the bitter winter wind, completely soaking her thin linen blouse, chilling her to the absolute bone whenever she stopped for a brief moment to catch her breath. She never stopped for long. She simply wiped the blood onto her soiled trousers and kept tearing away the endless decay. By the 8th day of grueling labor, she finally moved inside the claustrophobic structure. The smell of animal droppings, rotting autumn leaves, and stagnant water was overwhelmingly suffocating. She used a broken, jagged piece of plywood as a makeshift shovel, scooping up hundreds of pounds of saturated, disgusting garbage, hauling it out into the freezing rain and dumping it into a massive, growing pile near the dead elm trees. She ripped down the sagging, ruined ceiling panels, pulling out massive, dripping clumps of destroyed insulation that showered her face, hair, and eyes with toxic dust and hazardous debris. The roof was the most dangerous, terrifying battle of all. The corrugated tin sheets had rusted completely through in a dozen different fatal places, leaving jagged, razor-sharp metallic edges that threatened to slice completely through her thin, worn canvas gloves with every single careless movement. Eleanor built a crude, unstable, incredibly dangerous ladder out of salvaged 2x4s and rusted framing nails she pulled straight from the trash. She climbed 15 feet straight up into the freezing, punishing northern wind. The sky was dead.
She spent 3 agonizing, terrifying days balanced precariously on the slanted, slippery oak rafters. She gripped the cold steel sheets, pulling them free from the unyielding grip of corroded screws, sliding the heavy metal down to the muddy earth below, and carefully securing heavy, green waterproof tarps she had purchased with exactly 4 of her remaining dollar bills tightly over the exposed wooden joists. Her muscles burned with a fiery, exhausting lactic acid buildup that made every single movement a monumental effort of sheer, stubborn will. On the cold afternoon of the 14th day, the rumbling, heavy sound of an internal combustion engine broke the endless, suffocating silence. A faded red 3/4-ton 1972 Ford pickup truck crawled slowly down the pothole-riddled road. Behind the heavy steering wheel sat Silas Thorne. He was 72 years old, a retired master carpenter and structural engineer who lived completely alone in a modest, self-built cabin roughly 5 miles further into the deep, isolating woods. Silas was a widower. He had spent the last 10 years existing in a quiet, undisturbed vacuum of heavy grief after losing his wife to a sudden, aggressive illness, speaking only to the young clerk at the local grocery store and the occasional stray dogs that wandered onto his heavily wooded property. He slowed his heavy steel truck to a complete, groaning halt. He rolled down the manual window and stared intently. Silas understood buildings, and he deeply understood broken people. He looked at the massive, meticulously organized pile of cleared debris, the perfectly secured waterproof tarps on the sagging roof, and the clean, exposed oak framework. Then he looked at Eleanor. He saw a 67-year-old woman covered in dark mud, her hair gray with plaster dust, aggressively prying up a shattered floorboard with a heavy steel crowbar. He saw her bleeding, bruised hands. He did not feel pity. Pity was a terrible insult to a human spirit that strong. He recognized the unmistakable, rigid posture of absolute, unbreakable resilience. He saw a kindred soul, someone who deeply knew that the only real, functional cure for an unbearable tragedy was the steady, rhythmic swing of a heavy iron hammer. Silas turned the silver key, killing the loud, rattling engine. He stepped out of the heavy steel truck, his thick leather work boots hitting the gravel with a solid, grounding thud. He walked slowly to the rusted bed of his truck and unlatched a massive, dented steel toolbox. He pulled a heavy framing hammer, a thick leather tool belt loaded with exactly 3 pounds of 3-inch galvanized nails, and a sharp 3-foot steel pry bar. He also grabbed a dented silver thermos from the passenger seat of the cabin. He walked straight through the freezing mud. Eleanor immediately stopped her aggressive prying. She leaned heavily against her crowbar, her chest heaving rapidly, watching the tall, silent stranger approach her property. She tightened her grip on the steel bar, her expression entirely neutral and guarded.
"Good afternoon," Silas said in a deep, rumbling, gravelly voice. "Good afternoon," Eleanor replied smoothly, betraying absolutely no fear whatsoever. Silas did not ask if she needed help. He did not ask what a woman her age was out here completely alone in the freezing cold. He simply walked up to the small wooden porch, unscrewed the metal cap of his thermos, poured a steaming cup of pitch-black, bitter coffee, and handed it directly to her. The heat radiating from the metal cup was a profound, incredible blessing. Eleanor took it with shaking hands. "Thank you," she murmured quietly. Silas nodded exactly once. He stepped right past her, positioned his sharp pry bar under a stubbornly nailed floorboard that had been giving her intense trouble all morning, and threw his immense, practiced shoulder weight into the leverage. The rusted nails shrieked loudly against the wood, and the heavy board popped perfectly loose. They worked together for the next 10 consecutive days in an almost entirely unspoken, beautiful harmony. It was a profound, silent choreography of labor. When Eleanor measured a long length of salvaged timber, Silas was already handing her the handsaw before she could even reach for it. When Silas held a heavy 100-pound load-bearing beam perfectly plumb against the wall, Eleanor drove the thick framing nails into the solid wood with precise, powerful, unrelenting strikes. They ate cold meat sandwiches sitting on overturned plastic paint buckets, watching the winter sun sink low below the barren tree line, sharing a quiet, dignified understanding that simply did not require a single wasted word. Eleanor felt a deep, intensely unfamiliar sense of safety. Richard had never lifted a single hammer in his entire life. Richard hired cheap men to fix a simple dripping faucet, complaining loudly and aggressively about the small invoice. Silas was the exact, perfect opposite. Silas was the raw, unvarnished earth. His thick hands were just as ruined as hers, deeply scarred by decades of shaping stubborn wood and unyielding steel, and he moved with the steady, measured grace of a man who deeply respected the physical world. They completely rebuilt the rotting floor joists. They heavily reinforced the sagging walls with thick, diagonal steel bracing Silas had brought from his own barn. They worked tirelessly through freezing rain, through biting winds, and through the bone-deep, agonizing exhaustion that settled heavily into their joints every single evening when the temperature dropped below 30 degrees Fahrenheit. On the 24th day, the temperature dropped sharply to a bitter 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The interior of the 12-foot by 14-foot toll booth was finally cleared of all the rotting, disgusting surface debris. They had reached the deepest, oldest layer of the floor structure. Eleanor was sweeping out decades of fine, powdery dust with a stiff broom, while Silas knelt heavily in the far corner of the small room, examining a strange, unusually thick section of the wooden floorboards. "This grain pattern is entirely wrong," he said slowly, tracing his thick fingers over the smooth wood. "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked calmly, resting her heavy broom against the solid oak wall. He explained quietly, his gray brow furrowing in deep analytical concentration. "These boards are not simply nailed down to the joists, they are intricately fitted together with interlocking dovetail joints, and they are incredibly heavy, much too heavy for a simple floor covering." He tapped the dark wood hard with the heavy steel head of his framing hammer. It did not produce the hollow, resonant thud of empty space. It produced a dead, flat, entirely solid response. Silas wedged the sharp, flattened end of his heavy steel crowbar deep into a microscopic seam between the perfectly fitted oak boards. He gripped the cold iron handle with both of his massive calloused hands. He braced his heavy work boots against the concrete wall, took a deep breath of freezing air, and threw his entire body weight violently backward into the lever. The old wood groaned heavily under the immense crushing pressure. The thick dovetail joints violently snapped apart with a loud crack. The heavy oak board flew upward, revealing the dark, undisturbed cavity hidden directly beneath the floor. But there was absolutely no dirt. There was absolutely no poured concrete. As the heavy iron end of Silas's crowbar slipped past the splintered wood and struck the surface hidden directly beneath, an incredibly massive, deafening, entirely unnatural sound ripped aggressively through the quiet air of the freezing room. It was not the sound of a hollow water pipe. It was not the sound of a discarded piece of rusty scrap metal. It was a deep, resonant, impossibly heavy clank of solid steel striking solid steel. The sound was so incredibly dense, so overwhelmingly heavy, that it seemed to vibrate violently right through the thick rubber soles of their work boots and travel straight up into their very bones. Silas froze completely still. Eleanor stopped breathing. When Silas used the crowbar to pry away the next piece of shattered, splintering floorboard, the dull, impossibly heavy metallic clank of a massive steel vault resting silently beneath the earth echoed deeply into the freezing air, bringing their exhausting, back-breaking labor to an immediate, paralyzing halt. The deep metallic echo slowly faded into the freezing winter air, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. Silas did not speak. He simply wedged the heavy iron crowbar further beneath the splintered wood, his massive arms trembling slightly from the sheer physical shock of the impact. He pulled backward with unrelenting force, tearing away the rest of the intricate dovetail floorboards, throwing the ruined oak aside into the damp mud. Eleanor knelt immediately beside him, ignoring the sharp splinters biting deeply into her bare knees, her hands aggressively brushing away decades of fine gray dust and dead, dried insects. They uncovered a massive, perfectly square sheet of dull gray metal. It was lead. Eleanor recognized it instantly from her decades of analyzing commercial building specifications. A thick, heavy layer of pure lead sheathing was used in mid-century industrial construction to aggressively block ground moisture, prevent heavy rust, and insulate highly sensitive underground structures from drastic temperature fluctuations. She dug her bleeding fingers into the soft, pliable edges of the lead matting and pulled it back, peeling the heavy gray skin away from the floor. It was not a pipe. It was a subterranean door. Buried perfectly flush with the heavily reinforced concrete foundation was a massive 3-foot by 3-foot trap door forged entirely from impenetrable, military-grade tungsten steel alloy. It possessed no standard hinges, no simple keyholes, and absolutely no handles. In the exact center of the massive steel plate sat a heavy, intricately grooved rotating combination wheel, completely frozen in a thick, brutal crust of dark brown oxidation. "This is a bank-grade security vault," Silas whispered hoarsely, his deep voice barely carrying over the howling winter wind. "In a toll booth?" Eleanor replied softly, her sharp mind racing through the impossible logistics. The sun dropped entirely below the barren tree line, plunging the ruined structure into absolute darkness, and the ambient temperature plummeted violently to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. They did not stop working. They did not retreat to the heated cabin of the rusted Volvo. Eleanor retrieved 2 heavy tactical flashlights from Silas's truck, setting them on the ruined floorboards to cast a harsh, bright white beam directly onto the frozen locking wheel. Silas poured a thick, heavy puddle of industrial penetrating oil directly on the rusted gears. They waited exactly 20 minutes. Silas retrieved a massive 3-foot-long cast-iron pipe wrench from his heavy steel toolbox. He clamped the jagged steel teeth tightly around the outer rim of the oxidized wheel. He gripped the heavy handle, planted his thick work boots against the immovable concrete foundation, and pulled violently with the entire weight of his muscular frame. The wheel absolutely refused to move. "Hold the wrench," Silas commanded quietly. Eleanor grabbed the heavy iron handle, bracing her 67-year-old shoulders, gripping the rough metal until her bruised knuckles turned entirely white. Silas raised a heavy 10-pound steel sledgehammer high above his head. He brought the massive hammer down with devastating, bone-shattering force, striking the heavy iron wrench exactly on the thickest part of the handle. Metal screamed against metal, sparks showered wildly into the freezing air. He struck it a second time, a third time, and a fourth time, swinging the heavy sledgehammer with the steady, relentless, punishing rhythm of a man who had spent his entire life forcing the physical world to bend to his will. On the 7th brutal strike, a loud, sharp cracking sound echoed rapidly through the small room. The thick crust of heavy oxidation violently shattered. The heavy steel wheel turned exactly 1/4 of an inch. They spent the next 3 grueling hours working the heavy wheel back and forth, fighting for every single millimeter of rusted movement, pouring more oil, striking more blows, and ignoring the agonizing burning cramps tearing through their exhausted muscles.
Finally, the massive internal locking mechanism surrendered. 5 incredibly thick, solid steel deadbolts simultaneously retracted with a heavy, deeply satisfying clank that shook the entire concrete foundation. Eleanor grabbed the heavy steel wheel with both hands and pulled upward. The heavy vault door groaned loudly, a deep, agonizing sound of screaming metal that had not moved in over 80 years, and swung open on perfectly balanced, massive internal hinges. A rush of entirely stale, completely dry air blew sharply up into their faces. It did not smell like mold, dirt, or wet decay. It smelled entirely of old paper, heavily oiled canvas, and absolute, undisturbed preservation. Silas shined the bright tactical flashlight down into the gaping black hole. A heavy, welded steel ladder descended straight down. Eleanor did not hesitate for a single second. She swung her legs over the dark edge, placed her heavy work boots on the cold steel rungs, and climbed steadily downward into the freezing earth. Silas followed closely behind her, his massive frame blocking out the pale moonlight from above. They descended exactly 12 feet. The room below was 10 feet wide and 12 feet long. It was a perfectly dry, heavily armored subterranean holding chamber. The thick walls were poured solidly from high-density, steel-reinforced concrete, completely impervious to groundwater, shifting soil, or heavy structural collapses. Resting silently on heavy, rusted iron shelves bolted firmly to the far wall were 4 massive, olive-green metal lockboxes, completely sealed with heavy brass military padlocks. Eleanor approached the first metal box. The brass padlock had corroded entirely through, crumbling instantly into fine green powder when she struck it sharply with the edge of her heavy crowbar. She lifted the heavy iron lid, pushing it back on screaming hinges. Silas shined the bright white light directly inside. The box was completely filled with tightly bound, perfectly preserved stacks of crisp paper currency. They were not modern dollars. They were entirely uncirculated, perfectly pristine 1934 series U.S. silver certificates, each one bearing the bright, vivid blue treasury seal of the federal government. There were thousands of them, stacked in impeccable, unbroken rows, completely untouched by the devastating ravages of time. Eleanor moved mechanically to the second box. She broke the decaying brass lock and threw open the heavy lid. Inside sat dozens of thick, heavy canvas bags, securely tied with thick twine. She untied the nearest bag and tipped it slowly forward. A massive cascade of heavy, shining metal spilled out perfectly onto the dusty concrete floor, clinking loudly against one another in a beautiful musical rhythm. They were solid gold double eagles, minted in the late 1920s, completely unblemished and absolutely priceless to the modern world. The third and fourth boxes did not contain bags or paper. They contained incredibly massive 50-pound solid bullion bars of pure, unadulterated silver, neatly stacked like heavy firewood, each one heavily stamped with the undeniable, majestic seal of the U.S. Treasury Department. They stood together in the freezing, silent darkness. Eleanor did not scream. She did not jump, dance, or weep tears of overwhelming joy. She simply stared quietly at the massive, overwhelming fortune resting silently in the dark. She thought of Richard, sitting in his arrogant, stolen mansion, entirely confident that he had completely destroyed her. She thought of her $19.45. She reached out and slowly picked up one of the heavy silver bars. The cold metal felt incredibly solid, incredibly permanent, and undeniably real in her deeply scarred, bleeding hands. Eleanor gently wiped a thick layer of fine gray dust from the shining metallic surface, realizing with absolute terrifying clarity that her $5 decision had just violently altered the course of American history. But massive secrets rarely sleep peacefully for long.
Silas Thorne did not trust local authorities, and he deeply distrusted local banks. He drove 40 miles into the city, used a secure payphone, and placed a highly confidential call to an old trusted contact. 3 days later, a sleek black sedan crawled slowly down the fractured asphalt of old Route 42. The man who stepped out of the vehicle was Arthur Pendleton. He was a senior historical appraiser from a highly prestigious auction house in St. Louis. He wore a heavy wool overcoat, perfectly tailored trousers, and carried a thick leather briefcase. He looked completely out of place, standing in the freezing 30-degree Fahrenheit mud next to the ruined toll booth. "Show me," Arthur said simply, his breath pluming white in the freezing air. Silas led him silently inside the heavily reinforced wooden structure. Arthur climbed carefully down the heavy welded steel ladder, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the cold metal rungs. When he reached the solid concrete floor of the subterranean vault, he set his heavy briefcase down. He opened it, retrieved a pair of immaculate white cotton gloves, and slipped them onto his aging hands. He approached the first open lockbox. He did not breathe. Arthur picked up a single crisp 1934 series silver certificate. He examined the vivid blue treasury seal, the completely flawless paper grain, and the perfectly sharp, uncreased corners under the bright beam of Silas's tactical flashlight. He moved to the second box, running his gloved fingers reverently over the heavy, shining gold double eagles. He knelt beside the massive stacks of 50-pound solid silver bullion bars, his eyes wide, completely overwhelmed by the sheer impossible magnitude of the perfectly preserved historical fortune. His hands shook violently. "This is completely unprecedented," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling heavily with pure, unadulterated awe. "These certificates never entered circulation. They were completely erased from the federal ledgers during the chaotic banking transitions of the Great Depression. The government essentially buried them, locked the door, and lost the key." Eleanor stood quietly by the heavy steel ladder. "Who owns it?" she asked calmly. Arthur turned to look directly at the deeply scarred, mud-covered 67-year-old woman. "You do," he replied firmly. "You purchased the property completely outright at a county tax auction. The deed is clear, unrestricted, and legally binding. Because this vault was permanently discommissioned and abandoned by the federal government over 80 decades ago, the physical contents fall completely under the legal doctrines of lost and abandoned property." He stood up slowly, removing his white gloves. "Legally speaking, it is entirely yours." They spent the next 6 hours meticulously cataloging every single piece of paper currency, every heavy gold coin, and every massive silver bar. Arthur calculated the numismatic premium of the uncirculated bills, the current spot price of physical gold, and the incredibly high collector value of the heavily stamped government bullion. He wrote the final staggering sum on a piece of heavy cream paper and handed it directly to Eleanor. $3,820,000. Eleanor stared quietly at the written words. She did not weep. She did not scream in triumph. She thought briefly of the heavy, cold coins sitting on the cracked vinyl dashboard of her rusted Volvo. She thought of the exact $19.45 that was supposed to define the absolute end of her entire life. She looked up at Arthur. "Begin the auction process," she commanded softly. She calmly signed the heavy stack of legal authorization papers using a cheap plastic pen, her hand completely steady, completely unaware that back in the bustling city, an ambitious young clerk at the county courthouse had already leaked the impossible rumor to a very specific,
deeply greedy local businessman, and the quiet, dignified peace of old Route 42 was about to be violently shattered by the desperate return of the man who had thrown her away.
The bitter winter wind blew harshly across the cracked asphalt of old Route 42. A rusted, rented box truck rumbled violently down the dead road, its bald tires slipping erratically over the deep, freezing potholes. The heavy vehicle slammed to a sudden, chaotic halt just 30 yards from the newly reinforced oak toll booth. The driver's door swung violently open. Richard Vance stumbled out. He was a complete, tragic ruin. He no longer wore the immaculate $2,000 tailored Italian suits that had once defined his entire arrogant existence. He wore a stained, wrinkled, gray trench coat, completely inadequate for the biting 20-degree Fahrenheit wind that whipped violently across the empty acres of barren land. His cheap hair dye had grown out, leaving his thinning hair a chaotic, pathetic mess of harsh silver and dull black roots. He looked entirely hollow, his skin pale and deeply sagging, completely stripped of his former terrifying confidence. Because his own trap had completely liquidated every single offshore account, drained the massive corporate equity lines, maxed out 13 different platinum credit cards, and boarded a first-class flight to a country completely lacking an extradition treaty. She had left Richard entirely destitute, burying him under tens of millions of dollars of insurmountable, crushing corporate debt that would inevitably end in federal prison time. He was desperate. He was a drowning man. Richard marched aggressively through the freezing mud, his breath ragged, his eyes fixed wildly on the small, sturdy wooden structure. He completely ignored the massive, magnificent repairs. He only saw dollar signs. "Eleanor," he screamed, his voice cracking violently in the cold air. "Eleanor, get out here right now!" The heavy oak door slowly opened. Eleanor stepped out onto the small, newly constructed wooden porch. She wore her thick canvas work coat, her worn leather boots heavily caked in wet earth, and held a small, battered metal watering can. She did not flinch. She did not retreat. She simply stood perfectly still, looking down at the shivering, broken man who had coldly erased 44 years of absolute devotion. "I heard the rumors," Richard snarled, pointing a trembling, dirt-stained finger directly at her face. "The entire county is talking about it. A federal vault, millions of dollars hidden right under this pathetic pile of garbage." Eleanor said absolutely nothing. She tilted the metal can, letting a thin, steady stream of cold water fall on a small, resilient green sapling she had recently planted in a rusted tin bucket. "Do not ignore me," he roared angrily, taking a heavy, threatening step forward. "You bought this land with marital funds. You bought this property using $5 that legally belonged to my corporate estate. That makes half of everything buried in that ground mine. I want my half, Eleanor, or I will drag you through the Supreme Court until you are entirely dead and buried." He was lying. He had absolutely nothing left to hire a single lawyer. Eleanor finished watering the small plant. She set the metal can down on the wooden planks with a soft, quiet thud. She reached slowly into the deep inner pocket of her heavy canvas work coat. She pulled out a thick, neatly folded stack of heavy white legal paper. She held it out. "What is that?" Richard demanded suspiciously, taking a hesitant step backward. "Read it," Eleanor instructed quietly, her voice perfectly level, completely devoid of any anger, malice, or lingering sorrow. Richard snatched the paper from her calloused hand. His bloodshot eyes scanned the dense, complicated legal paragraphs.
The wind howled sharply, flapping the heavy pages loudly against his trembling fingers. He read the header, and all the remaining blood instantly drained completely from his pale, sagging face. It was the post-nuptial agreement. It was the exact, heavily weaponized legal document he had meticulously engineered to throw her onto the street with exactly $19.45. Turn to page 42, section 8, paragraph 3. Richard's hands shook violently as he fumbled with the thick pages. He found the paragraph. He read the incredibly specific, inescapable words that his own highly paid, ruthless lawyers had drafted 5 years ago. Any and all property, assets, real estate, or capital acquired by either party after the finalized date of divorce shall remain the absolute, undisputed, and sole property of the acquiring individual, completely immune to any future claims, legal challenges, or marital restitution by the opposing party. He stared at the words. He could not breathe. You demanded an airtight trap. You built a cage so perfectly strong that I could never possibly break back into your life. You locked the door. You threw away the key. And in doing so, Richard, you permanently locked yourself completely out of mine. Richard opened his mouth to scream, to curse, to violently tear the heavy paper into tiny, worthless shreds. But a heavy, commanding voice echoed sharply from the shadowy interior of the toll booth. I would strongly suggest you step off the lady's property. Silas Thorne stepped out onto the porch. He was entirely massive, holding his heavy steel framing hammer loosely in his deeply scarred right hand. Directly behind Silas stepped Sheriff Miller, the chief law enforcement officer of Oak Haven County. The sheriff wore his heavy winter uniform, his silver star gleaming brightly against the dark fabric, resting his hand casually on his thick leather utility belt. Mr. Vance, Sheriff Miller said sternly. Mrs. Vance invited me over for a cup of warm coffee this morning. She also showed me her completely legitimate, federally stamped auction deed for this exact parcel of land. You are currently trespassing on private property. Richard stood completely frozen in the freezing mud. I have rights, Richard whispered weakly, his voice breaking into a pathetic, hollow sob. You have absolutely nothing, the sheriff corrected him coldly. Now get back into your rented truck, drive back to the city, and do not show your face on Old Route 42 again, or I will personally lock you in a concrete cell for criminal harassment. Do you understand me? The silence that followed was entirely absolute. Richard looked up at Eleanor. He looked for a single ounce of pity, a tiny sliver of the unconditional, enduring love she had freely given him for 44 long years. She offered him nothing. Eleanor simply turned her back on him, picked up her small metal watering can, and walked quietly back inside the warm, deeply secure wooden structure, closing the heavy oak door completely shut behind her. Richard Vance stood alone in the freezing, biting cold. He slowly dropped the useless legal document into the deep, filthy mud, turning away in absolute crushing humiliation to climb back into his rented truck. The engine choked and sputtered. He was completely destroyed. The rented truck slowly faded away down the fractured asphalt, disappearing completely into the thick, gray winter fog, taking with it a pathetic man who had violently lost absolutely everything. While the barren, freezing land behind him quietly prepared to welcome the most beautiful, magnificent second spring of its long life.
6 months later, the bitter, punishing winter had surrendered to a lush, radiant spring. The once rotting, derelict toll booth on Old Route 42 had been completely transformed. It was now known as the 42 Rest Stop, a beautiful, expertly crafted structure of warm, honey-colored oak and rough-hewn stone. A wide, inviting wraparound porch featured comfortable rocking chairs, and the air was perpetually filled with the sweet, delicate scent of blooming wild jasmine and fresh roasted coffee. The property was a sanctuary. Eleanor Vance stood on the quiet porch, watching the golden, honey-colored rays of the late afternoon sun stretch across the emerald green fields. She wore a soft, comfortable cotton dress and sturdy shoes, her movements graceful and entirely at peace. Her fans, once raw and bleeding, were now smooth, though they still held the quiet strength of a woman who knew exactly how to build a life from the very dust. She had used only a small portion of the vast recovered fortune to build this modest, magnificent haven. The remainder of the wealth, millions of dollars in gold, silver, and currency, had been transferred into a private, irrevocable charitable trust. Its sole purpose was to provide long-term, stable housing and vocational training for women in Oak Haven County who had been left destitute by abandonment or systemic economic violence. She was not just surviving, she was flourishing. A local newspaper, resting on a small side table, featured a tiny, unremarkable paragraph in the back pages. It reported that a man named Richard Vance had filed for total bankruptcy and was now working as a seasonal, minimum-wage custodian at a desolate highway gas station 3 counties away. Chloe, his former wife, was currently awaiting trial in a federal detention center, facing dozens of counts of high-level wire fraud and international money laundering. They had been consumed by their own insatiable greed. Silas Thorne walked out from the interior of the rest stop, carrying 2 steaming porcelain mugs of black coffee. He sat in the rocking chair beside Eleanor, his movements slow and steady. They did not need to speak. They had built a profound, silent friendship, founded on the hard, honest work of 2 souls who had seen the absolute bottom and chosen to climb back up, one agonizing step at a time. Eleanor took the mug, feeling the comforting, gentle heat soak into her palms. She looked out at the rolling hills, watching the light change from brilliant gold to a soft, deep violet. She thought of the $50 bill she had once held in her shaking hands and the $5 she had used to buy a dream that everyone else had called a nightmare. People often believe that value is something you are given. They think it comes from the size of a house, the number of zeros in a bank account, or the status of a title, but they are entirely wrong. She took a slow, deliberate sip of the warm coffee. True value is not in the leaves that fall when the storm strikes. It is in the roots that remain buried deep in the earth. You cannot destroy a person who has decided to be their own foundation. You cannot bankrupt a spirit that has learned how to build something beautiful out of what the world calls garbage. The sun slipped gracefully below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in magnificent shades of fire and velvet. Eleanor Vance smiled, a small, genuine expression of deep, quiet triumph. She had found her way back to the light, and for the first time in 44 years, she finally owned not just the ground beneath her feet, but the absolute, undeniable freedom of her own soul.